You passed your NYDFS review. Frontier AI made it obsolete anyway. Your compliance program may already be obsolete. You passed your last NYDFS certification. Frontier AI didn't wait for the next review cycle. It looks like a paperwork gap. It's actually a speed gap. AI vulnerabilities now move faster than any annual review can track. NYDFS said so in writing this May. Not a violation yet. A structural blind spot examiners may begin focusing on. Here's the belief every compliance officer operates on. If your program passed its last review, your program is sound. That belief made sense for 20 years. It doesn't anymore. On May 21, 2026, the New York Department of Financial Services published AI-related guidance most compliance teams haven't read yet. It doesn't accuse anyone of anything. It doesn't cite a single violation. Instead, it does something quieter and more dangerous. It signals that the clock most institutions have been running compliance on may no longer match the pace of the threat. Think about a specific officer. Call her the signer. Every year, she reviews her institution's cybersecurity program under Part 500, confirms the risk assessment is current, and signs the certification. Last year, she signed it correctly. Nothing in that signature was false. But the world the signature described stopped existing months before the ink dried. That's the mechanism this episode maps, not a violation, a structural mismatch between how fast a threat evolves and how often anyone checks. Part 500, Section 500.09, requires a periodic risk assessment. Periodic, in practice, has often been implemented as an annual cycle for many covered entities since the rule took effect. That cadence was never arbitrary. It matched how fast the threat landscape used to move. A new attack technique might take months to develop, longer to spread. Annual review kept pace with that. Frontier AI puts pressure on that assumption. The advisory addresses this directly. It describes AI models as amplifying the speed, scale, and potency of vulnerability and exploit discovery, not incrementally, to the advisory's own framing. Meaningfully, a model can surface an exploitable weakness in hours that would have taken a human research team months to find. Here's the officer again. She built her program around annual review because that was a defensible engineering decision for the threat she was defending against. However, the threat changed categories while her calendar stayed fixed. She's not out of compliance. She's out of sync. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A vendor you failed to verify. That's a decision you can point to and correct. A calendar that's structurally too slow for the thing it's measuring. There's no single decision to reverse. The gap exists the moment the world moves faster than the review interval, regardless of whether anyone did anything wrong. NYDFS didn't fine anyone for this. It doesn't need to yet. It put the mismatch in writing, in official guidance, addressed directly to CISOs and senior officers at covered entities. That's not enforcement. That's the kind of documented notice examiners can point back to later when they ask whether you knew. Therefore, the real question isn't whether your last certification was accurate. It's whether accuracy measured once a year is still a meaningful standard. Picture two clocks. One is your review cycle, fixed, predictable, the same interval every year, regardless of what's happening in the world. The other is frontier AI capability, compounding, not linear, each generation finding more than the last, faster than the last. Those two clocks used to run at roughly the same speed. The advisory implies they no longer do. And a compliance program built entirely around the slower clock has no mechanism to notice when the faster one pulls away. This is where most institutions make their next mistake, and it's an understandable one. The instinct is to fix a cadence problem with more cadence. Review quarterly instead of annually. Add a mid-year check. That's not wrong exactly. It's insufficient. If the advisory's framing holds that frontier AI capability is accelerating, not holding steady, then the required review frequency isn't a fixed number you can land on and stop adjusting. It's a moving target. Reviewing 4 times a year solves this year's gap and reopens next year's. Now widen the frame past your own institution. Your vendors are adopting AI on their own timeline, invisible to you. The October 2025 guidance under Section 500.11 pointed the same way. Outsourcing the work doesn't outsource the responsibility for verifying it. That accountability stays with you even when the labor doesn't. What that guidance didn't fully anticipate is a vendor's AI adoption, aging your own risk picture in real time. On a calendar you have no visibility into at all. You're not just managing your own clock anymore. You're managing a clock you can't see, attached to a company that isn't yours. Here's the part that should concern anyone who's built a mature compliance function, not reassure them. The instinct is that maturity protects you. More process, more documentation, more discipline should mean more safety. Instead, a mature program optimized around a fixed annual cadence is exactly the structure now exposed. The newer, less disciplined shop that happens to review, more often by accident, is, perversely, closer to correct than the institution that perfected the wrong interval years ago. This pattern isn't unique to New York. In February 2026, Australia's federal court ordered FIIG Securities to pay $2.5 million under the general obligations of its financial services license, not a cybersecurity-specific rule, after a multi-year pattern of underinvestment in security controls. Different regulator, different country, same underlying logic. A governance decision, unrevisited for years, that quietly built the exposure. The decision isn't, we chose not to invest. It's, we chose a cadence that made sense until it didn't. And nobody revisited that choice because nothing forced them to. Delta Dental found out in April of this year, under this same Part 500 framework, exactly how expensive an unrevisited governance decision can become. $2.25 million, not primarily for the breach itself. NYDFS focused its findings on governance and documentation deficiencies, rather than the technical response. Delta Dental detected the intrusion same day, contained it, and reset credentials competently. The penalty primarily attached to what wasn't written down: a disposal policy the order found deficient, an incident response plan the order found inadequate, a reporting trigger the order found undocumented. A real breach, a competent response, and a multi-million-dollar fine, because the paperwork gap, more than the attacker, is what regulators could act on. Sit with that for a second. 2 regulators, 2 continents, 2 different legal frameworks, both landing on the same conclusion within months of each other in 2026. Underinvestment in a governance cadence is now something you get penalized for, breach or no breach, if a structural gap like this can already draw a $2.5 million penalty on one continent and a $2.25 million penalty on another. What does a cadence gap that reopens every time AI capability jumps, indefinitely, with no fix that stays fixed, actually cost over time? Nobody has a confirmed number for that yet. But the shape of the exposure is no longer theoretical. It's been priced twice, 4 months apart, on opposite sides of the planet. Now hold 2 things in your head at once, because both are true and only one of them is settled fact. What's closer to settled? NYDFS has published guidance describing frontier AI as accelerating the exploit discovery timeline in ways that pressure a fixed review cadence. What's not settled? No institution has yet been penalized specifically for a cadence gap of this kind. This is guidance. It creates no new rule. NYDFS says so directly. That distinction is not a technicality. It's the actual risk. A published rule tells you exactly where the line is. Guidance tells you a regulator is watching a category of behavior and hasn't yet decided where enforcement begins. That's a harder position to defend from, not an easier one, because there's no bright line to point to when an examiner asks whether your program accounted for this. This is the same evidentiary posture as October's third-party guidance under Section 500.11, a signal, not a penalty, that later became the connective tissue examiner's reference when something does go wrong. Guidance today can become the citation inside next year's consent order. Therefore, treating this advisory as optional reading because it lacks teeth right now is a bet against a pattern this same regulator has already run before, and a pattern two regulators on two continents have now both converged on independently. The escalation here doesn't stop at the individual signer, and it doesn't stop at the institution either. It moves outward. First, the officer whose certification was accurate when signed and stale within months. Then, the institution whose mature, well-documented program was built around the wrong interval. Now, the broader regulated population, every covered entity running the same fixed cadence model, all exposed to the same structural gap simultaneously, all watching the same regulator decide, in real time, when guidance becomes enforcement. Here's the decision lens, stated plainly. Stop asking whether your program is compliant. Start asking how fast the thing you're defending against is moving relative to how often you check. Those used to be the same question. They aren't anymore, and the gap between them is exactly what this guidance exists to name. Here's the risk filter. If your institution's answer to "How do we handle AI risk?" is a line item inside next year's scheduled review, that answer was designed for the old clock. The new clock doesn't wait for scheduled reviews. It compounds between them. This episode resolves one question and deliberately leaves another open. The immediate question, what does current actually require now, has an answer. A documented, explicit accounting for AI-accelerated risk inside your existing Part 500 program, not a static one-time addition, but something built to be revisited faster than your current interval assumes. The larger question doesn't resolve because it can't. Every future frontier model release reopens this exact gap. That's not a flaw in this analysis. It's the actual shape of the risk. A documentation project has an end date. A structural cadence mismatch against a compounding threat does not. This is now a standing operating condition, not a task to close out. Therefore, this isn't the last time this framework applies. The next frontier model release, the next capability jump, reopens the identical question for every institution running a fixed interval program, which, right now, is nearly all of them. If your compliance function is still measuring readiness once a year, you're not measuring the thing that's actually moving. Full sourcing, the confirmed guidance text, and our standing evidence and corrections log for this episode are linked below. Subscribe if you want the next one in this sequence when it happens, not if, when.